Order, order. We now come to a debate entitled This House considers a petition relating to Nigeria and the sanctions regime. I call Teresa Villiers to move it.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 554140 relating to Nigeria and the sanctions regime. I'd like to thank the 220,330 people who have signed this petition, or at least had done when I last checked it this morning, especially the 853 of them who are my constituents in Chipping Barnet. This petition has been prompted by the disturbing events in Nigeria over recent weeks. There have been widespread protests regarding the activities of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad of the Nigerian police, known as SARS. This unit has a deeply controversial reputation, and the hashtag #EndSARS started to appear prominently on social media back in 2017. Reports of violence and human rights abuses by SARS date back several years, but these latest protests followed circulation of a video in early October, shockingly, which many believe shows a man being killed by SARS officers. On the 11th of October, President Buhari announced plans to disband the unit. However, such promises have been made in the past, and yet SARS seemingly has continued to operate. This would in fact be the fourth time it was abolished. Many protesters therefore felt that disbanding SARS, even assuming it happens, would not be sufficient to tackle long-standing problems with police brutality, particularly if SARS officers are simply assigned to different parts of the police service. Activists are now calling for a complete overhaul of policing in Nigeria. They also want police officers responsible for beatings, killings, extortion, unlawful detention and other crimes to be held to account. So the protests continued, and thousands of Nigerians, most of them under 30, took part in events such as peaceful marches, candlelit vigils, multi-faith prayer sessions. People came together across divides, having different social, cultural and tribal backgrounds. Supportive comments flowed in from the Nigerian diaspora around the world, from celebrities, and the End SARS movement quickly widened beyond the concerns expressed initially about policing and started to capture some of the general frustrations of a young population demanding an end to poor governance and corruption. But I'm afraid the situation became far more grave on 20th October, when the Nigerian army and police opened fire on a peaceful demonstration at the Lekki toll gate in suburban Lagos. What happened is disputed, but Amnesty International have tracked events through photos and video footage posted by protesters. They show army trucks approaching the protesters from both sides of the toll gate, blocking them in. Shooting with live rounds started almost immediately, with no warning given. A local musician, Obianuju Catherine Ude, was streaming the events live on Instagram as it happened, and later she said, there was a guy that was running and he fell and we looked at him. He was shot in the back. Several people are now looking for missing loved ones, including Elisha Sunday Ibanga. An eyewitness told CNN that Elisha's brother Victor was shot in the head during the protest and his body was taken away. The US broadcaster report that they have seen a geolocated photo of Victor Ibanga lying in a pool of blood and wrapped in the white and green Nigerian flag, one of the same flags held by protesters earlier in the evening as they sang their national anthem. Similarly and equally tragically, Peace Okon is someone who hasn't seen her younger brother Wisdom since he went to the demonstration on the night of the shootings. She said, I've gone to hospitals, I've gone to police stations, I've gone everywhere, I can't find him. It isn't clear how many were injured or lost their lives in Lekki, but Amnesty International estimate that 56 people have died since the protests began. And they've documented many instances where excessive and disproportionate force has been used to try to control or stop protests. The shootings at the Lekki toll gate have sent shock through many in Nigeria. For many, it seemed like the last straw. The government there has promised judicial panels of inquiry to investigate what happened, but there is widespread scepticism about whether these processes will be effective in holding to account those responsible for the bloodshed and the human rights abuses which have occurred. And that concern is, I believe, felt by many constituents here in the UK, especially those with heritage or family links to Nigeria. This is illustrated by the huge support for this e-petition we're considering this evening, which asks the UK government to consider imposing sanctions. Now, as I read it, the petitioners are asking for Magnitsky-type sanctions against named individuals within the Nigerian government and security forces. There's a recognition that generalised old-style sanctions applied to the country as a whole might cause hardship to ordinary people not in any way responsible for the problems highlighted by the petition. So this debate is a vital opportunity to hear from the Minister and to have her respond to this urgent appeal from the e-petitioners. An appeal that the government consider imposing targeted sanctions against certain individuals believed to be culpable in relation to the violent and excessive police response to peaceful protests in Nigeria. The new Magnitsky sanctions regime started to operate in July, and I believe its creation is one of the best and most important foreign policy decisions made since the Conservatives returned to government in 2010. It puts us ahead of many other countries in showing how seriously we take human rights abuses around the world. It even, I gather, earned us praise from Guy Verhofstadt, which is undoubtedly a rare thing. But I believe that the petitioners have a credible case for the imposition of individualised sanctions such as travel bans and asset freezes. Now, of course, I appreciate there are real sensitivities about anything which might be considered interference in the domestic affairs of another country, especially where there was a previous colonial involvement. But I still hope that ministers should give serious consideration to what the e-petitioners request. And my second ask of ministers is that they provide reassurance about UK aid and security programmes which involve Nigerian police, military and security forces. In their responses to written questions on this matter, the government has emphasised these programmes are intended to improve transparency and accountability, as well as strengthen respect for human rights, the rule of law and protection of minorities. But I know my constituents signing this petition want more clarity and certainty about what these UK programmes have achieved and how they're assessed. I believe they'll be reassured if we have a clear statement that no UK taxpayers' money can be misused by security forces in Nigeria or in any circumstances deployed on activities which suppress peaceful protests. My third question for ministers is what representations they have or are prepared to make to the Nigerian government about human rights abuses against Christians. Charities such as Christian Solidarity Worldwide and Open Doors have documented a worrying increase in attacks on Christian communities in Nigeria by terrorist groups over recent years, and their plight must never be forgotten. Fourthly and finally, I would ask ministers to step up engagement with the Nigerian diaspora in the United Kingdom. There are many British Nigerians who want to deploy their knowledge and their understanding of the country to help shape the UK's response to unfolding events in Nigeria. Worried about the situation and distressed about the Lekki Tollgate tragedy and other loss of life, they're brimming with enthusiasm to help, to make a difference and to be involved in building a better future for Nigeria. In this regard, I particularly want to thank my constituent Lara Ayodeji Akindeji for contacting me to share her concerns and offer her help. Her support and briefing for this debate has been invaluable. So my final request would be to ask the Minister to meet me and a group of constituents to discuss these matters further. Mr. Gray, Nigeria is a country with so much going for it. A young and hugely talented population, massive natural resources and a rapidly developing economy. If the End SARS protesters secured the reform and the improved governance they're demanding, Nigeria could become a formidable economic powerhouse. And the diaspora community here can be a vital bridge linking our two countries in a brighter future of increased trade and prosperity in the years to come. Thank you.
This House considered e-petition 554150 related to Nigeria and the sanctions regime. Kate, someone.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the honourable member for Chipping and Barnett for her passionate opening for this debate. I would also like to thank Silas Oja for creating this petition, which now has more than 220,000 signatures, including almost 2,000 of my own constituents in Edmonton who signed the petition we are debating today. And I'm sure that I'm not the only member to have been inundated with messages from constituents in recent months, urging them to do whatever they can to lend their voice to the End SARS protests. As the chair of the All-Party Group for Nigeria, I was particularly keen to speak on this debate and highlight the need for the UK to stand with the Nigerian people against an increasingly cruel and brutal regime. The situation in Nigeria is incredibly serious, with tragedy after tragedy unfolding on the streets in state after state, as the Nigerian government and its security forces take ever more repressive measures to end a protest movement, which has given hope to millions across the globe. The End SARS movement is not just about disbanding the special anti-robbery squads. It is a movement led by the youth of Nigeria who took to the streets of Nigeria peacefully, demanding an end to brutality, extortion and extrajudicial executions, and for a truly democratic Nigeria. The bravery of the youth-led movement will never be defeated. Today, we need to consider how the government should respond to both the movement itself and the violent actions of the Nigerian regime. However, we must also take this opportunity to look beyond sanctions to a way in which development funding is spent in Nigeria. Instead of funding corrupt security services and investing in projects which do not benefit ordinary Nigerians, we need a new focus on poverty relief and anti-corruption programmes. Mr Gray, it is vital that we recognise the role of the UK and how these events have unfolded in Nigeria. Despite previously stating the opposite, the government has now admitted to funding SARS units for the last 4 years. That funding not only included the provision of training to those units, but the supply of equipment. At the very moment in which Amnesty International had declared SARS units to have been involved in extrajudicial killings, corruption and torture, the government was using the aid budget to train and equip those units. In fact, between 2016 up to this year, more than 10 million went towards programmes from which SARS units benefited. That is not only immoral, it makes it harder for UK to play a positive role in Nigeria during this vital period. How can the government, with a straight face, call for an end to violence against protesters, having helped train and equip the security forces who are carrying out that violence? So today, I hope the Minister will publicly apologise for the decision to fund SARS units and pledge a full and independent inquiry into this matter. Mr Gray, the 20th of October 2020 will be remembered as the Lekki Tollgate massacre, the day a deliberate and coldly calculated attack on peaceful Nigerian civilians was carried out by the Nigerian army. The Nigerian government has since taken part in an attempted cover-up of this massacre. Security forces in Nigeria make muted responses to the murder of protesters. While governments across the world have called on the Nigerian government and the security forces to stop killing protesters, the UK government has hedged its bets, issuing only weak and timid statements. It is therefore a gift to the Nigerian government when our government fails to explicitly condemn the Nigerian regime for killing its own citizens. So will the Minister today finally condemn the Nigerian regime for its part in the Tollgate massacre and the continued killing of peaceful protesters in Nigeria? Mr. Gray, the Nigerian government says that it has disbanded SARS, but the corruption and brutality of the security forces continues. The Nigerian government's violence against its own citizens appears only to be intensifying. The Nigerian government needs to stop freezing bank accounts of key protesters. It needs to stop illegal detentions of key protesters. The Minister of Information for the federal government went on record to state the CNN reporting of the massacre is, and I quote, fake news. This is undemocratic conduct, and it really needs to be called out. So I ask that the Minister uses this opportunity to end the UK government's neutrality on this issue. The UK must never be neutral when it comes to human rights abuses. Are the rights and needs and dreams of young Nigerian people not the same as those that are here in the UK? The UK should not be a safe haven for anyone who denies their own citizens the same freedoms they come to enjoy in the UK. Mr. Gray, all too often, when a repressive regime is targeted with economic sanctions, it is the civilians who pay the price, while the regime itself becomes more entrenched and less open to change. But the UK government can use the sanctions under the global human rights regime, which targets individuals involved in human rights violations and abuses. So, if the UK's position is a global force of good, then I ask the UK government to add the names of the Nigerian government and the security services to the designated list of those responsible for the worst human rights abuses. As I come to a close, it is time for the UK to change course and stand in solidarity with those fighting for a new Nigeria. Let's stand together. Let's get rid of corruption, extortion, extrajudicial murders and massacres, because it's time for a new Nigeria. And I thank you.
I'll do that.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, for calling me to speak. And I must say it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the Honourable Lady for Edmonton, who speaks quite rightly with great passion about one of the great countries in this world that is sadly being racked by violence, and violence against young people. Now, I would argue that the greatest book in the English language, and I know there may be some debate about this, but the greatest book in the English language is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian writer. And the beauty of that book is the way it explains the challenge of changing generations to live together, and the way it speaks about values falling away and community being eroded by outside pressure. What we're seeing in Nigeria today is part of that story. It's a tragedy that we are watching. It's a tragedy that we are all witnessing, because as we see things falling apart, the pressure this time is not foreign colonialism, forgive me. The pressure instead is corruption and violence and attempts at control. And that's why I totally agree with my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton. We need to call out the corruption. We need to use the powers that we have in this country to stop those who are profiting from the wealth of that great nation and hiding it here. Now, some people will remember when General Gowon left Nigeria with half the central bank, so it is said, and moved to London. We know that today, even now, in this great city of ours, there are, sadly, some people who have taken from the Nigerian people and hidden their ill-gotten gains here. We know that our banks, sadly, have been used for that profit and for that illegal transfer of assets. And that means that the UK is in an almost unique position in being able to actually do something to really exert pressure on those who have robbed the Nigerian people. Now, this puts a particular onus on the Minister, and I know my right honourable friend knows it, that using Magnitsky sanctions today isn't just about protecting Nigeria, although it is. It's not just about respecting Nigerian young people who have been robbed and murdered by these SARS units. It's actually about protecting the United Kingdom. Because what happens in Nigeria matters fundamentally to us here. This is the third country of the Commonwealth. This is a country of 200 million people. It is going to be the great economic powerhouse of Africa and one of the great economic powerhouses of the world. This is a country whose wealth, not just in the oil off the river state, but in the imagination and creativity of its people, is witnessed every day in Nollywood, and perhaps more my style, at the great University of Jos. This is a country that gives so much to the world already, despite the fact that it is ill-governed, brutalised and robbed. Just imagine what it could give if the Plateau State wasn't a scene of conflict and anti-SARS movements, but instead was the global centre of learning that it really, truly could be, and indeed was up until the 1960s. So look, this is an opportunity for the UK to do something real, not just in the interest of Nigerians, though it would be, not just in the interest of Africans, though it would be that too, but fundamentally in the interests of the British people. This is a moment when these petitioners have got it absolutely right. They are not just arguing for the rights of young Nigerians who are claiming their own rights. They are arguing for the rights of Democrats, of free people, and of honourable people everywhere. And I hope that my right honourable friend and her colleague, the Secretary of State, will listen, will look at the sanctions regime and choose very carefully where they apply.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to speak in this meaningful debate and to follow the honourable member for Tunbridge and Malling. The events surrounding the NSAS protest in Nigeria has caused global concern and outcry. Last month, mainly young Nigerian people took to the streets in a peaceful protest against police brutality. And on the 20th of October in Lagos and in other parts of the nation, the military are alleged to have attacked peaceful protesters with disproportionate force and have killed and injured civilians. The world watched the horrific videos. The world saw the awful pictures from the scene. The world heard the eyewitness accounts from survivors who managed to escape the horrors of that night. Human rights agencies such as Amnesty International have supported these claims. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Nigerian government and military initially denied that the military were at Lekki and labelled the events as fake news. Media companies received a memorandum from the Nigerian National Broadcasting Commission to silence them, not to embarrass individuals, organisations, government, cause disaffection or panic to the society at large, following reporting on the events of that dreadful night. Consequently, some media houses who did report on the events were fined. The bank accounts of some organisers involved in the protests have been frozen by the Central Nigerian Bank pending investigations. Some organisers involved in the protests have been arrested or harassed by the authorities. These actions equate to the preventing and indeed stopping free speech and the right to peaceful protest by the state, and this is unacceptable. Peaceful protests are vital to the functioning democracy and are a fundamental human right. These rights should be upheld and respected. Many of my constituents who have a Nigerian background are in great distress. Those that have relatives and friends in Nigeria are concerned about the safety of their loved ones and have contacted me about this situation. I indeed have close friends in Nigeria who are also deeply concerned and have contacted me about this. They all ask for one simple thing, that the UK government defends the right to peaceful protest and free speech and ensures that those within the Nigerian government and army are held to account for the atrocities committed against peaceful protesters. Given the shared history between the UK and Nigeria, and as a fellow member of the Commonwealth and ally, the UK has its duty to stand up for human rights of Nigerian citizens. In the case where Nigerian officials are avoiding accountability over the killings of protesters, I believe that the UK should be looking to impose sanctions on state officials involved in the human rights abuses of Nigerian citizens. In July of this year, the Secretary of State for Foreign Commonwealth and Developmental Affairs introduced the Global Human Rights Sanctions Regulations. Under this statutory framework, priority themes relate to cases that threaten media freedom and human rights defenders. Furthermore, another priority theme considers cases where the relevant jurisdiction law enforcement authorities have been unable or unwilling to hold those responsible for human rights violations or abuses to account. The government clearly have the tools to ensure that Nigerian state officials respect the constitutional and fundamental human rights to protest and free speech. If those who ordered and facilitated the killings and harm to protesters are not held accountable, then the UK government should advocate for independent investigations to take place. And following investigations, any individuals found responsible for these atrocities of human dignity must face sanctions.
Right.
I'm very grateful, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it's really good to see you looking so well. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member too from Chipping Barnet for introducing this debate, for her passion, and also to all of my honourable friends, also for their passion, their expertise, and their clear demands that we're making today in this chamber. And it's good to hear that the demands are unanimously held across what is sometimes a divide. As we know, the SARS police unit was suspected of abuses against thousands of innocent Nigerians over the past 28 years. It's sadly clear that Nigeria does have a serious problem with abuses of state power and with corruption which goes way beyond SARS. The protest movement that we are seeing rise in Nigeria wants all of these abuses addressed. SARS and other police forces were well known for targeting young people, for arrests, extortions, beatings, almost at random. I'm told if you're young, if you have the wrong hairstyle or clothes, or if you're driving a car and playing music, you could be targeted. Your money and your possessions could be seized with no evidence, and people know if you resist, you will be beaten and possibly killed. SARS created an environment of fear and injustice, and until the protest, there was no real sign that those in power were listening or prepared to act. It appears to be, sadly, just the same with many other issues in Nigerian society. There's terrible unemployment, there's little access to healthcare and to education, and a poverty rate as high as 70%, according to Oxfam. The people of Nigeria have the right to come together and call for an end to those injustices. But as we know, in recent months, their peaceful, powerful actions have been met with horrific violence. Amnesty says that at least 56 people were killed during the recent protests, including at least 10 in Lekki. I've been fortunate enough to hear from a young journalist with direct knowledge of what happened at the Lekki tollgate. And she told me, and I'm going to read out her words. She said, and I quote, "It was devastating, something you don't want to imagine. The protesters did not know that the cameras and the lights were going to be removed. There were no cameras to witness anything." And then, as we've heard today, the soldiers opened fire on the crowd of protesters, and my contact said one of the survivors jumped in the water, but the soldiers kept on shooting. For days after, a friend of mine didn't come online because of the shock and the fear, and it took him a long time to come to Facebook and to say, "Thank God I survived. I did not think I was going to. She said, someone else I know left the toll gate with a bullet in him, and later they moved all the bodies so that there would be no evidence. For them to close their hearts and kill protesters like that is simply unforgivable. The response from the authorities who feel threatened by the protests has been insidious, as we've heard. Media agencies have been fined for telling the truth. Bank accounts of activists have been suspended because supposedly they finance terrorism. And government spokespeople have even blamed the protesters for a rise in food prices. Those in power will clearly do anything at all to ensure that the movement ends now and that SARS is technically disbanded. Those in power are terrified that the calls for action on corruption and police brutality will go on and on. My plea to the Minister today is that we stand with the young people of Nigeria who are demanding change far beyond the closure of SARS. What they are demanding is a future worthy of their courage and their leadership. And here in the UK, we need that too, because Nigeria is a massive, fast-growing, youthful country. It has massive potential. It's a country that will have a leading role in decades to come, not just within Africa, but in our world. And for that positive leadership to happen, that sense of justice that motivates the End SARS protest must prevail to shape Nigeria's future and our future too. So, Minister, I don't think that words from the government today are going to be enough, because I think we've got to show our solidarity, demonstrate it, by identifying and targeting those that we know are responsible for terrible violence and abuses that the activists have faced. The least we should do is to make sure that those who have murdered Nigerians and deprived them of their human rights aren't able to benefit from trade or travel to the UK. In my view, that should include the leaders of the government and the military who are now, even now, refusing to allow transparent and fair investigations to happen and for justice to be implemented. What I want to hear from the Minister today is that a list of Magnitsky, I never say that word properly, sanctions is being created and action against those on that list taken in weeks and not years. Our role in this must be, I think, to work with all that we can to identify those responsible and ensure justice is done. And I would be so very grateful if on this occasion the government acts decisively.
I will tell you.
Thank you, Mr Gray, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to follow the honourable member for West Ham who spoke so passionately for justice for Nigerians. I would also like to thank the member for Chipping Barnett for securing this very important debate. Now, this, of course, was a popular debate, and it's unfortunate that my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, was not called to speak in this debate, and she sends her solidarity with the End SARS movement. Now, I must begin by addressing the horrific violence we've seen inflicted upon young Nigerian civilians who were peacefully expressing their fundamental human rights against police brutality. As seen on media platforms, armed military officers discharge live ammunition at these peaceful protesters, injuring and killing them. It is, however, unfortunate that as of today, both federal and state government in Nigeria have issued conflicting statements on the event that occurred at the Lekki tollgate. This has left us with a series of yet still unanswered questions. Who exactly ordered the military to shoot live ammunition in a civilian territory? Why were bank accounts of some individuals who partook in the protest frozen? Mr Chairman, if a democratic country deprived its people of their aspiration, livelihoods and voices, strips its people from their loved ones, forces them into hiding, and instills fear of retribution through violent attack on free speech, then that country can only be a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. Is Nigeria a dictatorship? Now, having now asked this question, I leave the Nigerian public to decide that for themselves. I must now address the question of sanctions, which is what we are here to discuss. If we can ensure that these sanctions will not negatively impact civilians, whether directly or indirectly, then I do support a travel ban and asset seizures sanctions on individual officials found responsible. Now, while discussing sanctions is crucial to determining how we as a nation will respond to the violence recently accumulating in the NSARS movement, it can only be the tip of the iceberg. We must use our platforms to hold the Nigerian government accountable through more than just sanctions. We must do the right thing by the people in Nigeria protesting for their own human rights and ask the questions they've given us the platform to ask, which is, what role did the Nigerian government as a whole play in these attacks? Will there be an independent investigation into the over 100 cases of torture, rape, extrajudicial execution throughout the NSARS protests? The reason the world knows about the violent attacks on Nigerian protesters is because civilians on the Lekki Tollgate massacre bravely risked their own lives to post these videos on social media. Only a few Nigerian news outlets even reported these stories, and they were all subsequently fined before the Nigerian government denied the attacks' existence and began silencing reporters. Agencies and individuals have since blamed one another. No one seems to be taking the responsibility. Nigerian civilians risk everything to give themselves a voice, and that they use to expose the atrocities inflicted upon them. And today, 4,000 miles away, the Nigerian government is strangling that voice with a proposed social media censorship bill. We must demand transparency of what is happening to civilians and amplify that news using our platform. We must continue to seek clarity on what happened on October the 20th, when power was cut from the Lekki Tollgate and SARS police forces began spraying protesters gathering there with bullets. Now, I'm sure that many of us have seen the footage of peaceful protesters linked armed in arms, singing the Nigerian anthem as they were indiscriminately gunned down. Now is the time to hold officials to account for their crimes against humanity that they have embarked on. So I call for an impartial human investigation into these human rights violence and to begin a process to secure justice for victims and their family. As we try to make sense of the incidents, we must ask uncomfortable questions of ourselves. I'm referring to the fact that British officials trained SARS police squad from 2016 up until this year, 2020, and they also trained the Nigerian army. Now, I have to ask, what did this training actually entail? Could it have prevented escalation of this kind? Now, standing here as a proud British Nigerian, I implore the Minister and colleagues across the House to pursue answers to these questions and do what it can to facilitate Nigeria's fight for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, for chairing this debate, and it's an honour to follow my honourable friend for Coventry and North West. I also like to thank the Honourable Member for Chipping Barnett for putting forward this debate in response to the petition which calls for sanctions against the Nigerian government and officials. It's a very timely debate that needs to be had. The atrocities that we have seen in Nigeria in recent months are understandably very concerning for my constituents. I know many of my constituents who have friends and relatives in Nigeria and want to see our government help ensure their safety. I firmly believe that we have an obligation to condemn violence and human rights abuses where we see them, which is why I have publicly condemned the violence that took place on the 20th of October when young people's rights to protest were tragically suppressed. In Erith and Thamesmead, 4,469 people have signed this petition that we are here to debate today. This is the highest amount of petitioners across the constituency seats. I have been contacted individually by dozens of people who want to see action to ensure that human rights are upheld in Nigeria.
One constituent wrote to me to say recently that she watched a documentary on how Nigerian military opened fire on unharmed children who were happily and peacefully demonstrating and carrying Nigerian flags. Many were killed mercilessly. She said she cried and said to me, "This could have been anyone." My constituents are right in demanding we see long-term action. A statement of condemnation, like my colleagues have mentioned just now, is not enough. As a country which subscribes to international human rights law, we must be quicker to act to support those who are having their rights infringed upon them around the world. Accountability is the cornerstone of democracy, and I was pleased to see the Minister of Africa write to me to confirm that the UK government will continue to work with the Nigerian government and international and civil society partners in support of police reform. However, it is clear that suitable methods of accountability have not been implemented. It was just yesterday that the Nigerian military admitted that soldiers fired live bullets at anti-SARS protesters on October 20th. However, there is still no confirmation about the number of young protesters who have tragically lost their lives. According to Nigerian officials, 2 young people were killed in the shooting, but reports by Amnesty claim there are 10 lives that were lost. How can this be considered appropriate accountability if we cannot even reach a consensus on the amount of lives taken at Lekki Toll Plaza in Lagos in October? I do not believe placing economic country-wide sanctions in Nigeria will help address these ongoing issues of police and military violence. In the first instance, the UK government should be calling for an independent investigation into the allegations of misconduct by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Organisations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who have been following the abuses that have taken place in Nigeria for years, should be consulted in their evidence and collated alongside an independent investigation to form a judicial review. Furthermore, the investigation should look at wider issues of violence and human rights abuses by military and police across Nigeria. Mr. Gray, the UK government should regard the findings of an independent investigation with the utmost seriousness and take action to implement sanctions across individuals identified as being responsible to the atrocities that have taken place. They should also make appropriate adjustments to the overseas military security and justice assistance funding and training of any Nigerian military, security and policing organisations which may have committed violations in line with the government's own guidance to ensure OSJA funding meets our human rights obligations and our values. Mr. Gray, this issue does not begin and end at Lekki Toll Plaza on October the 20th. There have been reports of violence by Special Anti-Robbery Squad since 2017, and there continue to be serious consequences as a result of protests which took place earlier this year. Young people have reported intimidation by the Nigerian government following protests, and as mentioned by a number of my colleagues, there have been reports of bank accounts frozen, social media banned, and people being detained in prison for their involvement in speaking out against police violence. These actions are unacceptable in democracy and claims of accountability for its wrongdoings. No action can replace the lives that have already been lost, but that does not mean that we cannot take action. I hope at the end of this debate we will get a commitment from the Minister that the UK will follow up their actions to hold officials in Nigeria responsible. Mr. Gray, I finally want to take this opportunity to raise the case of Nigerian DJ and songwriter DJ Switch, who has had her life threatened for her role in speaking out against military and police violence. The prominence of young Nigerian females at the forefront of EndSARS protests has highlighted the need for more action to take
taken to end violence against women and girls in Nigeria? Will the government take this opportunity to ensure that these actions in upholding human rights around the world extend to protecting women and girls against violence? Thank you, Mr Gray.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and a pleasure also to take part in such a cross-party consensual discussion, and glad to hear some excellent contributions from honourable and right honourable members across the House this evening about events in Nigeria. I'd also add my warm congratulations to the right honourable member for Chipping Barnett on bringing this forward and the drafters of this petition. I'd above all else, though, commend the NSARS movement, which I think has done so much to shine a bright light on the corruption and oppressive practices of the regime in Lagos. And I've read the government's response to the petition carefully, and I have some concerns. Nigeria is not a far-off place of which we know nothing. The UK has clear links to this issue and clear links to Nigeria, both historically and going forward. We have influence, and we could use a lot more of it. Now, we do know that the UK did fund, did supply equipment, did train police and paramilitary forces, which we now know have been involved in abuses. At the very least, surely, we need an urgent review of the UK's involvement in those programmes, and I'd be glad of an undertaking from the Minister this evening that such a review is underway. On the Magnitsky sanctions which have been called for, I quote directly from the government's response to the petition: "This sanctions regime will give the UK a powerful new tool to hold to account those involved in serious human rights violations or abuses." I've yet to hear any member of this House speak against the Magnitsky regime. We all support it. But it's only a tool if it's used. Now, I appreciate that speculation is unhelpful, but we do need some announcements, surely. I'm glad that the Minister for Africa, in his discussion with the Governor of Lagos on the 11th of November, called for an investigation into the specific instances we've heard of. Could we have an update in how that investigation is going, and an undertaking that there will be consequences to the findings of that investigation, and if it's been insufficient, that there should be an independent review? More generally, we need to look more in the round at whether the UK's actions help or hinder the aims of the NSARS protests. Between 2015 and 2020, the UK licensed arms exports and riot control equipment to the tune of £43 million. So, at the very least, we should, pending a review of our actions and effect of the UK's foreign policy and trade policy within Nigeria, surely suspend arms exports to the country. Mr Gray, the NSARS regime, the NSARS movement, could be a new Arab Spring for Nigeria. Given all the demographic, economic forces in play, all that enthusiasm is there. We must learn from history and not let the NSARS movement down the way we did the Arab Spring. For that would be a tragedy, and that would bring culpability upon us even more than we have. It's not just enough to express solidarity while aiding and abetting and arming and funding the oppressors. And the UK has a case to answer here. We need to look back into the consequences of our action and make sure that we do all we can to ensure accountability on the ground. I do look forward to the Minister's comments this evening.
Stephen Doughty.
Well, thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship as always. And I wanted to thank the right honourable member for Chipping Barnett for introducing the petition today, and to all the members who've taken part for incredibly powerful and passionate contributions on such a crucial issue. Also thank the comments from the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but in particular my friend, the Chair of the Nigeria APPG, who has done so much work to speak out on these atrocities, not just when they happen, but long before that, in terms of the wider SARS movement and the brutality that they have been exposing. And we've heard incredibly powerful speeches today from the members from Lewisham East, West Ham, Coventry North West, Erith and Thamesmead, and indeed the SNP spokesperson. And I know there are other colleagues, as was pointed out, who would have been here, Mr Gray, but have equally been speaking out very powerfully on these issues. And I too want to thank the over 200,000 individuals who have signed this petition and its creators. And that, of course, includes many significant signatures from the Nigerian diaspora here in the UK, but also all the others who share deep concerns concerns about what is happening in Nigeria, and when it comes to wider human rights abuses around this world. This is not a country, Mr Gray, that will turn a blind eye when such atrocities are happening. And the scenes we have witnessed and the reports that have come out of Nigeria of the response by the police and the army against protesters involved in the NSARS movement have shocked us all. And of course, we've heard from many of the contributions today of the events of the 20th of October, when a group of NSARS protesters were fired upon, it appears, by members of the Nigerian army at the Lekki Tollgate Plaza, after the CCTV was taken off and after the lights were turned off. And of course, the tragic deaths and injuries that resulted as a result of that action. And I spoke, Mr Gray, to those who had been around in the vicinity of these incidents, who have seen and witnessed firsthand the brutality meted out by SARS and by those attempting to defend them. And I can tell you they were shocking testimonies, Mr Gray, and I know that many of us have witnessed the video footage and pictures of the events, absolutely horrific. Now, despite the Nigerian army having denied it for over a month, it has been finally forced to admit at the Judicial Panel inquiry that soldiers were deployed to the Tollgate protest with both blank and live ammunition. And as many honourable members have pointed out, we still see some of those protesters still in detention today, and many others having financial restrictions and other actions taken against them. And I would be interested to know what assessment the Minister has made of the situation today with those who were involved in those protests. But of course, as many have explained today, this massacre and the other atrocities that we've seen are only part of the picture. They are part of a picture of brutality over a number of years, extraordinary brutality and violations by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, otherwise known as SARS. And the report from Amnesty International documented 82 cases of human rights violations between January 2017 and May 2020, including various methods of torture against detainees, such as hanging, mock execution, beating, punching and kicking, burning with cigarettes, waterboarding, near asphyxiation with plastic bags, forcing victims into stressful bodily positions, and sexual violence and rape. It is a shocking record of behaviour. And yet few of these cases have been investigated, and hardly any officers have been brought to justice on credible accounts of torture and other ill treatment. The authorities have promised investigations, but they often have simply not occurred. And the federal government of Nigeria has repeatedly promised to reform SARS, but has failed to do so. And of course, the protests we've seen recently originate not only in that record of brutality, but in other documented incidents across the country, in Delta State, in Oyo State, and in recent days I've received reports of extrajudicial killings by, allegedly, the Nigerian army in Oyigbo, too, in Rivers. What assessment has the Minister made of those most recent reports? This is still carrying on after those shocking events that we have seen just a few weeks ago. Mr Chair, the violent repression of protesters in Nigeria is unacceptable and has garnered, rightly, international condemnation. President-elect Biden has called on the Nigerian government to end the violent crackdown. The UN Secretary-General has said that Nigerians' right to protest peacefully needs to be guaranteed and that police brutality needs to stop. And we in the official opposition absolutely agree with those sentiments. The violent crackdown on these protests must end, and there must be accountability for those responsible for such brutality and loss of life. The Leader of the Opposition, my honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, have made it clear that the UK must act as a force for good in the world, and we must act in line with our international partners and multinational organisations, whether that's the UN, AU, the UN Human Rights Council and others, to encourage and strongly advocate for the end of this violence in Nigeria, to end police brutality in Nigeria, and crucially to call for independent investigations into these violations by Nigerian policing, security and military forces. Obviously, it would always be better if we had confidence in the systems of investigation within a country, within Nigeria, but the ongoing failures and the ongoing record of the government in dealing with SARS, I think, underpins why so many do not have faith in that process, and that is why independent investigations will be so crucial. Now, this petition specifically refers to sanctions, and Mr Gray, we in the official opposition welcomed the Foreign Secretary's establishment of a Magnitsky-style sanctions regime, which we had been calling for since 2018, to allow for targeted sanctions based on attacks on human rights and to enable us to target the wider network of perpetrators, including all of those who facilitate, incite, promote or support such crimes. And that, of course, extends beyond state officials to non-state actors as well. And the Foreign Secretary told us at the time in the House that these would be used to target, and I quote, those with blood on their hands. Well, it's clear, Mr Gray, that individuals do have blood on their hands in relation to the activities of SARS and these atrocities over the last few months. And given the allegations against members of SARS and the growing evidence of the atrocities that were committed, we would urge the UK Government to use its full investigative capacity, including drawing on the evidence provided by independent human rights organisations in Nigeria and elsewhere, to identify individuals responsible for these atrocities and, if appropriate, designate them for sanctions under our Magnitsky regime. We cannot stand by in the face of such willful perpetration of human rights violations and killings, not least given our close political, economic and security relationship with Nigeria. We cannot be a disinterested or unconnected party. I want to turn, Mr Gray, to the UK's own role in relation to SARS, and we've heard this from a number of members in the debate so far. Despite initially denying it, the Minister for Africa has admitted that through the Conflict Stabilisation and Security Fund in Nigeria, SARS members were trained as part of the Nigeria policing programme, and that the UK Government has been involved in training of members of SARS, despite that happening during a time when there were ongoing public, well-known allegations of extrajudicial executions, extortion, torture and rape by this unit. And I'm sorry to say, Mr Gray, but this is while shocking, it is unfortunately not an entirely unexpected revelation to me. And it's also not surprising, and I have the review of the programme here, Mr Gray, that this was a programme led by the Foreign Office rather than DFID. Of course, UK support for security and justice reform in countries around the world can have positive impacts. But what's absolutely clear to me is that in a growing number of cases, it is not clear what impact we are having, or whether in the worst cases we are actually supporting agencies who have a role in committing atrocities or human rights violations. This is just one example. Whether it's this example or the ongoing supplying of arms to the Saudi Arabian government for use in the Yemen crisis, or the training of the Special Investigations Unit in Bahrain, which has also been complicit in the torture of prisoners, and of course they use the death penalty. The government is having to repeatedly have to come and justify its involvement with organisations and institutions that appear to breach our very own standards, let alone international law and human rights. So can the Minister tell me whether she has considered suspending support and training for such programmes for Nigerian security, military and justice institutions until she is absolutely satisfied that they are not supporting individuals and organisations who have been implicated in these atrocities? And will the government commit to a review of the effectiveness of OSJA projects? I was extraordinary to reading the summary, Mr Gray, to find that the programme was listed as scoring an A and an A in 2018-19, and that the risk was only medium. This does sound to me to be completely, out of kilter with the facts that we have heard today and that we've been hearing for many, many years. And of course, looking beyond Nigeria, given the deeply concerning news that we're hearing coming out from locations across Africa in recent weeks, what measures is the government taking to protect human rights across the continent and to tackle those responsible, whether those responsible for atrocities in Ethiopia or those who are involved in suppressing the democratic process in Tanzania and Uganda? We cannot have impunity for those taking out atrocities or war crimes, whatever their role or status, whether that's official, unofficial, official government sources, official military sources, or irregular forces who are acting on behalf of different groups, whether those are central governments, regional governments, rebel groups. It doesn't matter who they are. We cannot have impunity for those people who are carrying these out. And it appears to me a double irony, Mr Gray, that we are seeing support for wrong programmes like this when the government we hear is proposing cutting the right programmes, proposing cutting the 0.7% target, proposing cutting support to development and peace programmes across the world. And I hope the Minister will be able to perhaps reassure us that that is not going to happen. But Mr Gray, in conclusion, from the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA to the NSARS movement in Nigeria, it's clear that any democratic government must respond to the needs, first and foremost, of its citizens in providing policing and security that is accountable to the people that it serves, does not hold itself above the law, but defends the law and conducts itself in line with the principles and values that underpin it. We stand on the side of all of those in Nigeria who are calling for peace, for democracy and for the rule of law to be upheld. Killings must end, democracy and the rule of law must prevail, and the UK should be a partner to all Nigerians seeking peace, justice and development.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Gray, and it's a pleasure to take part in this debate this afternoon under your excellent guidance and chairmanship, so thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, for securing this debate. And actually to all the members who have contributed today. We've heard from the member for Tonbridge and Marling, from Edmonton, Lewisham East, West Ham and others, and for all the contributions that you have made. I will endeavour to answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. I can't say within the time allowed because we're doing quite well on the time at the moment, I think, Mr Gray, but I know you will keep me in good order and not let me get carried away here. But this is an important debate, and the Minister for Africa has asked me to offer his apologies to those of you here in the House, and as he is away on ministerial business and he's therefore not able to attend. But I do know he has a very close interest in this topic, and I feel sure that he will be following this debate with great attention, as we would expect of the Minister for Africa. So I will therefore respond on behalf of the government in his place. We are grateful to the nearly 220,000 members of the public who signed the petition and enabled this debate to take place. There is, quite rightly, significant public concern about the recent protests in Nigeria, especially the issue of police brutality. I also acknowledge the strong feeling about this issue in this place, and I am thankful for the contributions from all colleagues today. And as I said, I will try to respond to all of the points raised. But first, let me set out the government's position on the protests and on police reform, and then I will address the topic of sanctions. I would like to assure the House that the government is following developments in Nigeria since the protests very closely. We are deeply concerned by violence during the protests, which tragically claimed lives. And I'm sure honourable members here today will join me in passing on our condolences to the families of those affected. The UK supports the right to peaceful protest. We condemn violence by any party, and in doing so, make an important distinction between the rioting and looting that took place and the original peaceful protest movement. We have raised the protests and the response to them at the highest levels within the Nigerian government. The Foreign Secretary issued a statement on the 21st of October calling for an end to the violence. He called for the Nigerian government to urgently investigate reports of brutality by its security forces and to hold those responsible to account. The Minister for Africa spoke to Foreign Minister Onyema on the 23rd of October to reiterate his tweets that recognised the Nigerian people's democratic and peaceful calls for reform and encouraged the Nigerian authorities to restore peace and to address concerns over brutality towards civilians. The British High Commissioner in Abuja continues to raise the protests with senior representatives of the Nigerian government, including our concerns about intimidation of civil society groups and peaceful activists. We welcome President Buhari's decision to disband the Federal Special Anti-Robbery Squad, the police unit at the centre of recent protests. And it's important that historic reports of police brutality and violence during recent protests are investigated fully. We also welcome the emerging dialogue between state governors and young people. In a country where more than 50% of the population is under 25, this conversation is so important in understanding the concerns of the next generation. And we also welcome the President's request for his Cabinet Ministers to do the same in their home areas. And lastly, we welcome the establishment of judicial panels of inquiry to investigate all the alleged incidents. I can also update members that the Minister for Africa spoke to the Governor of Lagos on the 11th of November. And he also spoke to the President's Chief of Staff, Ibrahim Gambari, on the 21st of November. He stressed the importance of police and military cooperation with the panels. He also expressed the urgent need for panels to progress investigations, including into the incident at Lekki. As you see from the government's written response to this petition, we continue to monitor these investigations and their outcomes very closely. We also continue to monitor progress on police reform and to support Nigerian-led reform. Earlier this year, for example, we supported civil society efforts to secure the successful passage of the new Police Act. Implemented effectively, this Act will be an important step towards a more transparent and accountable police force. Turning now to sanctions, Mr Gray, I would like to set out the Government's position on sanctions. On the 6th of July, the Government established the Global Human Rights Sanctions regime, and in a statement to Parliament, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, set out its full scope. It gives the UK a powerful new tool to hold to account the perpetrators of serious human rights violations or abuses. It's a long-standing practice not to speculate on future sanctions designations, as to do so could reduce the impact of the designations. The sanctions regime complements our ongoing human rights activities around the world and demonstrates that this country's commitment to be a force for good. And we will continue to keep all evidence and potential listings under very close review. Before I come to my rounding off my conclusions, Mr Gray, though, I want to try and touch on a few more of the points that have been raised by honourable members today. Yes, of course.
Can I say I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for being here this afternoon, and given that the Minister wasn't able, because of foreign travel, to be with us today. All of us have asked for sanctions. I think it would be courteous to the committee if the Minister for Africa wrote to us, outlining the government's position on this and why we are not being assured this afternoon that sanctions will be happening.
No doubt the Minister will have read Hansard. It's not actually in order for this group, this debate, to call for that letter. So it's a perfect sensible thing to ask for, and no doubt it may well occur, but the Minister is not required to answer the particular point.
Thank you, Mr Gray. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her friend, and as I said, I'm sure the Minister for Africa will be following this debate. I have a few more comments that I will make on sanctions, but I would like to just try and answer a few more of the other questions and say a little bit more on sanctions, if she will just bear with me. So, I wanted to just reiterate the point that, on sanctions, it is a long-standing practice not to speculate on our future sanctions, as this could reduce the impact of those very sanctions. Honourable members, Mr Gray, have mentioned and raised the issue of corruption. And I agree with honourable friends that tackling corruption in Nigeria is absolutely critical to the country's prosperity and security, and to reducing poverty and inequality. And work is underway to consider how a global corruption sanction regime could be added to the government's armoury. Members also raised the issue of intimidation, and I would like to just touch on that, because I think most members here today, or several members certainly, gave examples of intimidation that had been highlighted to them. And we are aware, Mr Gray, that some protesters have reported facing intimidation. And the British High Commissioner in Abuja continues to raise our concerns about intimidation of civil society groups and peaceful protesters with the Nigerian government. This does not build an environment for groups and protesters to come forward and really help build genuine accountability. But I can assure members that we are aware of that some protesters are facing intimidation. Members also raised the matter of UK aid. I think that was my honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet. And I would like to just say that and reassure her that no UK taxpayers' money goes directly to the Nigerian government. The UK provides assistance to Nigeria to meet immediate humanitarian needs and to address long-term structural issues. While I'm on the topic of aid, I know the honourable gentleman opposite does try to tempt me regarding the 0.7% commitment, but as I'm sure he would anticipate, I'm not going to speculate ahead of any spending review.
Not in that, not in that. No.
I just wanted to ask her if she could elaborate. I mean, I appreciate that she's not the Minister for Africa. She'll be less familiar with these specific programmes. But I mean, it was very clear in the Minister's letter to us that the UK government was funding training programmes that directly involved SARS, despite the allegations. Does she not believe there's a problem here with our wider security and justice assistance programmes, including across the world, because we keep getting example after example after example where they're either being questioned about their impact or, worse still, that we are being implicated in some way in organisations that are not upholding our standards?
Thank you. The honourable gentleman must have sort of preempted some more of my notes, because I'm going to touch a little bit more on the SARS programme, and hopefully I can give him a bit more detail and as to you know, the work that we're doing and what we are supporting. Before I come to that, just a quick note, because the Honourable Lady for Chipping Barnet also raised the point of the persecution of Christians, which again I know was another important topic. And just to, you know, to reassure her that we made clear to the Nigerian authorities at the highest levels the importance of protecting civilians, including Christians, and human rights for all Nigerians. But I now come on to SARS and the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Mr Gray, the UK supports police and justice reform in Nigeria. All assistance is compliant with our human rights obligations and our values. And through our CSSF-funded Nigeria policing programme, which ended in March 2020, Federal Special Anti-Robbery Squads, or FSARS, officers participated in training on amended Nigerian police guidance designed to improve human rights, training on public finance and community policing workshops. The Nigeria Policing Programme was part of our Security and Justice Reform Programme, which is working to help deliver a criminal justice system that better protects the human rights of all Nigerians. As a result of the programme, Mr Gray, relationships between communities and the police improved in 4 states. Trust was built, with communities and the police working together to resolve safety and security issues. The Nigerian Police Force's recent adoption of the Community Policing Framework, developed by the Nigeria Policing Programme, is a positive outcome. Our support to civil society was instrumental in the recent passing of the Police Act by the President, and this new Act provides for greater citizen protections and improved police training, which we believe will benefit Nigerians. Through the CSSF-funded North East Public Safety and Security Programme, part of which is delivered jointly with USAID, radio equipment was issued to Borno Police Command. This was for police units working to improve local security and to counter violent extremist organisations, including Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa. Borno Police Command distributed 3 radios to the local FSARS unit, which were returned after FSARS was disbanded. The North East Public Safety and Security Programme is part of our North East Africa Security, Conflict and Stabilisation Programme, working to help stabilise one of Nigeria's poorest and most fragile regions affected by Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa. But to conclude, I understand and I acknowledge and understand the strength of feeling in the House and among the public. The UK and Nigeria have a long and close relationship that extends beyond our governments to our people, especially through the British Nigerian diaspora community, which contributes so much to this country. And the diaspora was also raised by my right honourable friend who led this debate, the Honourable Lady for Chipping Barnet. The UK is home to over 200,000 members of the Nigerian diaspora who contribute so much to this country. And as I'm sure, Mr Gray, you will be aware, my honourable friend, the member for Saffron Walden, was the first minister for Nigeria. In terms of communications and engagement with the diaspora, on the 18th of November, the Minister for Africa led a virtual business roundtable with members of the Nigerian diaspora business community to better understand challenges to increasing trade and investment between the UK and Nigeria. And the roundtable was also joined by and my honourable friend, the UK Trade Envoy to Nigeria, and the British Deputy High Commissioner in Lagos. And I know that the honourable lady raises, asks whether she could request a meeting with the Minister for Africa. It would be wrong of me perhaps to commit him to that, but I can certainly pass on her request, Mr Gray. But this government will continue to press the Nigerian government and its security services to uphold human rights and the rule of law, to investigate all incidents of brutality, illegal detentions and the use of excessive force, and to hold those responsible to account. We will closely monitor the judicial panel of inquiries and continue to advocate for investigations into police brutality. The government will consider its options as the panel's work progresses. The government would also continue to work with the Nigerian government and international and civil society partners to improve the accountability and transparency of the Nigerian police for the benefit of all Nigerians.
Theresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr Gray. Well, like others, I believe this has been an excellent debate with well-informed contributions, with real insight, both from backbench and front bench. And I would take this last minute or two just to really urge the Minister and the rest of the team at the Foreign Office to use all diplomatic means they have available to get the message to the authorities in Nigeria that they need to listen to what the protests are asking for, and that I do hope that whilst the Minister, for all sorts of reasons, has felt unable to make commitments on targeted sanctions today, I think there is a really strong case for doing this, and I hope that behind the scenes the Foreign Office will continue to pursue this, so that in the not too distant future we will see an announcement on that. We've heard obviously in this debate some really disturbing accounts of what happened at Lekki, but also of a long history of brutality and extrajudicial killings, and particularly grim accounts were recounted by the Shadow Minister. But I very much hope that we also take away from this debate the optimism that I think everyone showed about the future for Nigeria. It has so much potential. As the Honourable Member for Edmonton says, you know, there's real potential for a new Nigeria, a better future. And I hope that these protests do signal a real change towards addressing those concerns around corruption, around brutality, around poor governance. Because if those issues are resolved, if we see real progress on that, we can see huge success and flourishing in Nigeria, not least in economic terms. So it's been my privilege to lead this debate. I thank all the people who signed the e-petition. I think this is a great example of the e-petition process working really effectively, because nearly 250,000 people signed that petition. We here in the Mother of Parliaments get the opportunity to urge and advocate for change and reform in Nigeria, and it's been my privilege to take part in that process.
The question is, this House e-petition 554150 relating to Nigeria and the sanction regime. Is there can say aye? Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.